So the information within this class is for educational purposes only. So reference to commercial products or trade names does not imply the endorsement by UT Extension or bias against those not mentioned. So this evening we are going to start off with the 10 best practices for canning goods, and then we'll go into water bath canning, and then a little bit about pressure canning, and then I will actually take you into my dining area to show you some of the different pieces of equipment that you can purchase to use for home canning. And you may actually already have some of these pieces of equipment within your own homes also. So one of the first things to talk about is that food spoils or loses its quality. So most fresh foods have a very high water content, and so this makes them very perishable. So they will spoil or lose their quality because of the growth of undesirable microorganisms, some physical damages, or even chemical damages that they might get while in process. So typically microorganisms will live on the outside of these produce. So, and they typically multiply really quickly. And so if any fresh food, any fruits or vegetables are bruised, or if there's any insect damage, or if it's disease, then it has a higher probability of it, more microorganisms getting into it. And then the chemical changes that occur in the food. Some of these are natural, so you'll naturally find some enzymes in food. And so a lot of times these enzymes are natural and they help the food grow and mature, and they actually continue to work after we harvest them. So it can change the flavor and the texture of food. And so food also reacts to the oxygen and loses quality. So some microorganisms that are concerned within home canning is yeast, mold, and bacteria. So some common sources of these microorganisms are, of course, in the soil and water. So these food needs soil and water in order to grow, so it's going to be a natural occurring type of thing. So with yeast, it can actually grow at a wide range of pH and at refrigeration temperatures, but they do have several benefits, and so they help in the production of bread and wine and coffee and cocoa, some olives, some pickles, sauerkraut, things like that. That's what is used for yeast to make. But it can also contribute to the spoilage of the food. It can also produce many different colors, from that creamy to pink or even red. And some of the off things that may happen with yeast is it can produce a slimy spoilage, souring or greening. And then it can produce a flavor of fruity or yeast odor, and it can produce gas formation. Molds, very few molds causes disease in humans. So they can be synthesized by a mycotoxin called aflatoxins, and so they have been shown to be toxic. So yeast mold can grow in a wide range of pH also, and it can grow at a pH much lower than food spoilages. So it can be useful also. It does have benefits. You can make cheeses out of it. One example is blue cheese. The other thing is they use it to make sausages such as salami, and then also development in antibiotics. And so mold is also a spoilage organism, and so it's frequently known as some of the fuzzy growth on foods. And so you can see in this picture here that some of the fuzzy growth on a food product there. And then microorganisms, bacteria is not harmful, some are even beneficial. So bacteria is used for fermentation, and it's typically used to make cheese, pickles, and soy sauce, sauerkraut, vinegar, wine, and then also yogurt. So it does cause spoilage. Some bacteria does cause spoilage. So of meat, seafood, milk and dairy products, breads and cereals, and produce. And it can or cannot produce gas. So it will produce, it can produce an abnormal odor or cloudy liquid. And then it's also the one that will cause your cans to swell and burst.
Hey, Elizabeth.
Yes.
We have a couple people saying that they can't see the screen that you're sharing. Any suggestions on fixing that?
Or if they're on their phone, they might have to slide over. Or if they're on a tablet, they might have to slide to either the right or left to get to the PowerPoint. One of the things that is very known for home canning is botulism. And so it is from the Clostridium botulinum. And so the thing with this one is you cannot see it, you cannot taste it, and you typically can't smell it. So with extreme temperatures used in canning, it does typically destroy most pathogenic bacteria. But botulism is one of those that it creates a spore. And so when in home canning, it creates the right environment for that spore to potentially become a vegetative cell. So we'll go a little bit over that here more in a little bit, probably more in the pressure canning aspect of this class. So one of the most well-known botulism outbreaks was with the Gerber family. And so these are actually, I know it's kind of somber, but these are actual caskets of individuals who ate home canned green beans. And so the family member made this green bean salad out of these green beans. And so anybody who ate that actually perished from this. And so these, one thing is that she did not follow modern canning recommendations. So this was typically in 1918, 367 cases were reported. And then the Albany tragedy in 1924. And so 230 proved fatal. So botulism is a toxin and it's produced by the Clostridium botulinum bacteria, like I was saying. It typically lives in soil and is grown only where there is no oxygen. So spores can survive in improperly canned food. So if the food is consumed with these spores, they become vegetative cells and they produce a very powerful neurotoxin. But modern canning methods have eliminated most threats of botulism, but nonetheless, there are still about 100 cases reported each year in the United States, according to the CDC. So it's one of those that you don't want to kind of mess around with. So this is kind of an illustration of the spore structure of the Clostridium botulinum. And so when they vegetate, or when the conditions are favorable, it will cause the spore to become a vegetative state, and then this is where it produces the toxin too. So that's why it's important for pressure canning that you follow a tested recipe. The tested recipes, they put a lot of research into it to determine the pressure and the time that food product needs to get to in order to prevent this from happening. So one of your big goals is to preserve quality and do it safely for your fruits and vegetables. So the number one thing is to use up-to-date methods and tested recipes. So a lot of these, you'll hear anytime that you call an extension office, they will tell you that, to use a tested recipe. So a couple of different places, you want to make sure that the recipe that you use is 1994 or after. There actually have been some updates to some of those recipes, but a couple of safe resources that you can find some tested recipes. One of them is called So Easy to Preserve. It's put out by the University of Georgia. We actually, some of us have this in our offices. So if you're interested in potentially purchasing one, you might contact your local extension office, or you can go to soeasytopreserve.com to purchase that. The other one up here in the right-hand corner is the USDA Home Guide to Canning. This one you can actually find online, and it's a downloadable PDF. And so this one particularly, if you can see my video, I actually have a copy of it. And so this is kind of what it looks like. It's very colorful inside, so that you can see different pictures, and it's got different graphs and things like that in it. The other one, of course, is the UT Extension Canning Foods publication that we have. And so towards the end of our class and the PowerPoints, I will give you the websites to where you can find the USDA Home Guide Canning, and then of course our publication at UT. And the other one that's very important to know, the website, is the National Food Preservation website. And this is manned by the University of Georgia, who actually does all the testing for the USDA. The second thing is choosing quality food. So for safety, so you typically want to choose good quality fresh food. So you want to be careful about selecting foods that are not damaged, moldy, or bruised. So damaged produce provides opportunities for these microorganisms to penetrate the outer surface of the food. So to penetrate the skin, get in there and cause some damage and reduce the quality of that food. So also the clock is ticking. So if you are one that is going to start their own garden here this year, or if you purchase your fruits and vegetables from local farmers markets or farmers, typically you have 6 to 12 hours from harvesting to actually getting to canning that food, because after that your quality of your food starts going down. So if you wait a while to actually can it, the quality of that food is not going to be as good. So typically if you can't get it right after you harvest it, you want to store that food in a cool, dry place. A lot of people put it in a refrigerator, hold it there until they're ready to actually process it in a canner. The other thing is ripen some foods. So there's some foods that you actually have to let it ripen. And these are apricots, nectarines, peaches, pears, and plums. They should be ripened for 1 or more days between harvesting and canning, just so you can get that best flavor that you want. So when you preserve these foods, if you wait too long to actually can them, it doesn't improve the quality of that food. So just kind of keep those things in mind. You also want to begin with some clean produce. So you do want to make sure that your fruits and vegetables are washed before you get started. You want to wash them thoroughly. This helps reduce any microbial load that might be on the outer surfaces of that food. And it reduces the chance that food will spoil or lose its quality over time. So actually some fresh foods will need to be peeled. And so you'll see tomatoes are on here, and tomatoes are one of those that you actually need to peel them before you can them. And so there's an easy way to do that. A lot of times, typically you want to, on the blossom end of your tomato, you want to make an X, just a small X in it. And you want to put those tomatoes in boiling water for about 5 minutes. And then you want to pull them out and then put them in an ice bath and let them cool down. And it should be easy for you to peel off that skin. That's the easiest way. Or if you're just one of those that you are really good at peeling, you can do it that way too, not have actually putting in that boiling water and then ice bath. So pre-treating some foods will prevent browning. So putting them in ascorbic acid, a lot of times you'll see this as like fruit fresh. So it helps prevent that browning of that food. So apples are one of those that you typically kind of want to put that ascorbic acid on. You want to make sure that you get food grade ascorbic acid when you do this. The next thing is you might need to blanch some of your vegetables. So blanching is scalding vegetables in boiling water or steaming them for a short time. So this stops the enzyme actions, which can cause loss of flavor, color, and texture. And blanching also cleanses the surface of the vegetables to remove any soil or organisms. And so blanching actually brightens the color of some of your vegetables. So, you know, green beans is one of those that you'll see it, it'll become a very bright green. So you'll see that color change from when you harvest it to blanching it to actually canning it. Blanching can also reduce the loss of vitamins, and it will wilt or soften vegetables to make them actually easier to pack. So we'll talk about the difference between raw packing and hot packing, and kind of so you have that idea. And so in the freezing and drying class that we will have next week, you'll actually have access to a freezer book or freezing foods book. And so in that, it will actually give you a table that tells you exactly how long to blanch certain food items. The next thing is adding some acid to some foods for safety and quality. So you can use vinegar, commercial grade lemon juice, or citric acid. So with the vinegar, you want to make sure that it's at least 5% acidity, and it is good to get that commercial vinegar. You don't want to use homemade vinegar for this. The commercial one, they have formulated to be at least at 5%, but you do want to make sure and check that it says 5%, because there are times where it can be lower than 5%, and I've seen that in grocery stores and certain brands of vinegar. The next thing is using commercial grade lemon juice. Of course, you'll find this in the juice aisle of different places, or within the fruits and vegetables, the produce area of that grocery store. And the other thing is that you can use a citric acid, and you can find this where the canning equipment is at in your local grocery store. Typically, citric acid is not going to change the flavor that much of some of the foods that you may put it in. And so one of the things is a lot of people will add acid to is your tomatoes. And also, adding acid, you should not leave this out if that recipe calls for a specific acid, because the acidity of food is very crucial. So you can see in this graph, so typically foods with a pH that's less than 4.6 are a lot of times your fruits. So except for figs, Asian pears, and tomatoes, they're kind of on that brink. And then foods with a pH greater or equal to that 4.6 are your meats and your vegetables. And so you want to, 4.6 is kind of the breaking point of where botulism can actually grow. And so that's the reason why you want to add the acid to your tomatoes. Tomatoes are one of those that either whether you water bath can it or pressure can it, you still want to add that citric acid into your jars. And so on the citric acid bottle itself, it'll tell you exactly how much citric acid to add within each jar. So the hot packing, a lot of individuals will do hot packing of many foods. And so what hot packing does is you're cooking the food before it's actually packed in the jar, and it removes any excess air. It helps shrink the food, and it also keeps the food from floating in the jar. And so, and it will increase the vacuum in the seal of jars. So it does improve your shelf life. Whereas raw packing, the food is unheated before it's packed into the jars. So a good example of raw packing you'll see is usually pickles is a good example of raw packing, whereas the hot packing, a good example is like green beans that you typically will heat up before you put in a jar. If a recipe calls for you to only do hot packing, that's the method that you want to do. There are several recipes out there, though, that will give you guidance in doing raw packing and hot packing. The next thing is making sure that you use a two-piece lid in mason jar type. And so the two-piece lids, and I'll show that to you here when we get into the kitchen there, but these are more recommended, and so you're actually able to take off the ring from the jar whenever you store it to prevent it from rusting. You don't want to use mayonnaise type jars, old jam jars that you get from like the grocery store, or pickle jars or peanut butter jars. It's because those two-piece lids don't lie on that surface as well as if it was, because the two-piece are designed for your mason jars. So you kind of want to be mindful of that. You also want to make sure that you check your mason jars every year before you get started to make sure there's not any cracks or nicks or anything in your jars. Because you don't, especially on the outer ring of the jar, because that seal from the lid will not seal right onto that jar. So you just want to check those. And of course, antique jars, even though they look nice and pretty, they look pretty as decorations, they're not recommended to use for home canning. So there's actually three different ways that you can home can. And so, of course, on the left-hand side is an example of a water bath canner. The example in the center is more of an atmospheric steam canner, and this is more for like water bath canning. It's kind of a replacement of water bath canning. And then the one on the far right is your pressure canner. And so these are the three different ways. Typically, most people are going to use either the water bath canner or the pressure canner. The water bath canner typically reaches, it's for boiling, so you're going to reach at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And then with pressure canning, it can get anywhere from 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the ultimate question that we get recently is, can I use my multi-purpose cooker to can things? And so these are actually not safe for canning, even though they say they are. There is no legitimate tested recipes or anything like that to back this up. So you just want to make sure they're good for cooking items. They're good for if you're wanting to cook a roast or something like that for the evening. But it's very important not to use it for canning, even though it may have that setting on there. This is not recommended for home canning. The other thing that's not recommended is open kettle canning. And so this is an old-time way to can foods. So foods are actually heated over a fire and added to jars, then allowed to seal from the heat already in the jar. So it may seem like the jar is sealed, but if there's not enough heat, the seal will not last and the food will spoil during storage, or Clostridium botulinum bacteria can grow in it. The other thing is dishwashers and microwaves and ovens. This is also not recommended to do those because they do not destroy the microorganisms within that canned product. So you want to store your foods properly. So once you get them canned and in their jars and canned properly, then you want to actually store them properly. So storing them in a clean, cool, dry, dark place is highly recommended. So usually temperatures between 50 to 70 degrees is ideal to store these. So if you place them where there's where it's very hot, where there might be hot pipes or a range or furnace or just direct sunlight, it can lose its quality in just a few weeks and or even months. And then depending on the temperature, it can even spoil that food product. So because there are certain microorganisms that are heat-loving spoilage bacteria whose spores survive the canning process. So if the storage temperature is too high, it can actually cause food spoilage. So just to kind of reiterate some of the 10 best practices, of course, use up-to-date methods and tested recipes, choose quality foods, begin with clean produce, pre-treat some of your foods, blanch your vegetables, add acid to some of those foods, hot pack many foods, use two-piece lids or mason type jars, and then process your food safely and store those food items safely. So the next thing that we are going to discuss is water bath canning. so water bath canning is one of those. It's a good way to start if you've never canned before. A lot of us in the extension do offer home canning classes where it's actually hands-on canning, so that you kind of get the feel of it and know what it's like before you kind of jump into it at home. And so this is kind of a good way to get your hands in that, to start the water bath canning. So with water bath canning, you typically do water bath canning with acid or acidified foods. And so examples of these are like jellies and jams, your fruits, your pickles, salsas. The low acid or your meats or vegetables are typically going to be pressure canned. And so we'll go over that one here in a little bit. So with water bath canning, the temperature reaches about 212 degrees, and this is at sea level. Of course, the higher you are up in the elevation, the lower that temperature will go down. So altitude can affect how long you actually process your foods. So like I was saying, it does make a difference. So it's important with the altitude that you make those adjustments in processing time in the water bath canner. So as altitude increases, water boils at a lower temperature. So the lower temperatures are less effective for killing bacteria. So processing time actually must be increased. So a good example is jams or jellies. I make a lot of blackberry jam. You know, I usually typically have to add about 5 minutes on to what that recipe calls for, the recipe that I particularly use. So it's important that you look at those recommendations to see how much time you need to add to that specific recipe. So here's kind of an illustration of what a water bath canner looks like. So you will have, it's basically a big, huge stock pot. And so you want to make sure that this pot is not more than 4 inches wider than the diameter of the stove burner. So if it's too large and it fits over 2 burners, that's the jars that are in the middle is not going to get enough heat. So you got to make sure that it fits over that. You also want to have a rack. And I'll show that to you here actually live, and so you'll see that. But you also want to get a rack, and so the rack actually goes down into the canner, and it keeps the jars off the direct heat of that bottom of the stock pot. You also want to make sure that it's tall enough to where you have at least 1 to 2 inches of water covering those jars, and then also 1 to 2 inches of airspace for that boil to happen. You also want to make sure that you have a lid that does fit onto the top of that canner. So one question that we do get a lot of is about smooth top stoves. So you do want to check with your manufacturer to see if it is a possibility to can on one of those. I will show you an example of an electric water bath canner that is fairly new on the market that I use here a lot lately. It's fairly easy to use, and it's easy to transport to different places. So you'll get to see that one here. Also, along with the most well-known water bath canner. So when you water bath can, you want to make sure that you preheat your water to 140 degrees or 180 degrees. So the 140 degrees is more for the raw pack type foods. The 180 degrees is more for the hot pack foods, getting that to that temperature. You also want to fill your jars while the water is heating. So you also want to pay attention to headspace. And so headspace is that space that in between the top of the food product to the lid. And so usually a 1/4 inch of headspace is needed for jams and jellies, 1/2 inch for fruits and pickles, and then 1 inch is typically used for vegetables or low acid foods. But your recipe will tell you the exact headspace that's needed for that particular food product. You do want to load 1 jar at a time and make sure that you're not tilting it. because if you tilt it or if it accidentally tips over, some of the water or syrup or the jam or jelly may leak out of it, and you won't get that proper seal that you need from that lid. And a lot of people also what they want to do is when after it's been processed and everything and they're taking them out of the canner, they want to tilt the jar just to get the water off of the top of the jar. Don't do that because it may not be sealed all the way yet. So you have to just lift it up straight up and over onto either towels that are on the countertop or one of those cooling racks that you might have. So you may also have to add more water as needed. If you're doing a lot of jars, if you're doing a lot of canning, of course the water is going to evaporate. So it's good to have another pot that has some warm water in it so that if you got to add it into the canner to get that 1 to 2 inches of space over the top of the lids, that will be important too. You also want to make sure that when you get to the point where you loaded your canner, you want to make sure that you get your water up to that rolling boil, and it needs to stay at that rolling boil for that amount of time. So if the recipe calls for 20 minutes of a processing, so it needs to be 20 minutes of that rolling boil. If at any time it stops boiling, then you actually have to get it back up to that boiling point and then start the timer over again. And so those are some important things with home canning, water bath canning. And then lastly, what we are going to be talking about this evening is pressure canning. And so pressure canning is one of those a lot of people are a little afraid of it. And the reason being is because they've heard of things blowing up. And that is a good possibility, especially if it's an old canner before 1970. They don't have a lot of the safety features that the newer ones have now. And so, of course, with this pressure canning, Clostridium botulinum is one of those that can potentially happen. And so this is that spoilage organism that you can see on food as it grows. So the extreme temperature used in canning will destroy most pathogenic bacteria. The exception, of course, is that Clostridium botulinum. So, and unfortunately, like I said, this bacteria cannot be seen or tasted. And this is just what it looks like under the microscope. So with pressure canning, as you can see with water bath canning, it got that water temperature up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Where with pressure canning, it's getting up to 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And so another big difference between this is with water bath canning, you're going to use a lot of water in that canner. Whereas with pressure canning, you're only using about 2 to 3 inches of water in that canner. So you're just, what's heating that up is the steam that's created within that canner. You typically want to use, you're going to do pressure canning for those foods that are greater than 4.6, their pH. So processing times, a lot of work goes into the directions for processing vegetables and other low acid foods because it is important to know how long it takes to kill the Clostridium botulinum bacteria at any given temperature. So in this case, 240 to 250 degrees. So this is important as temperature. This is why processing time should never be altered. Processing times for pressure canning include the amount of time it takes to reach the desired pressure, the time the correct pressure, and then the time it actually takes to depressurize that pressure canner. So you reducing the time at any point can actually affect how well you destroy that bacteria. Even the time, amount of time it takes for the pressure to come down. That is why we never force the canner to depressurize. Some people want to speed that up. They want to put it in a cold water bath to speed up that depressurizing time. You don't want to do it. You just kind of let it do it on its own. Typically, if you have an older canner, that has very thick walls. It takes about 30 minutes for those pints, or yeah, loaded with pints, and then 45 minutes for those that are typically loaded with quarts. Whereas with the newer canners, you can tell when they have been depressurized because they have something called a vent lock. So when there is pressure built up into the pressure canner, this lock pops up, and so you're not able to open up the lid of the canner. When you know there's not any more pressure into that canner, that lock will actually pop back down. So this is kind of looks like an example of what an old pressure canner looks like. You also, this one has an old dial gauge. It has the clamp on or turn on lids. Those are a couple different styles. With your pressure canners, you do want to make sure that you get them checked every single year before you actually start canning to make sure that they're accurate. And your local extension office can do this for you. Typically, it takes less than 5 minutes to test one of the canner lids. And they just, they're testing against a master gauge to make sure that the gauge that is on your pressure canner lines up with the one that's on the master gauge. And so there's recommendations if it doesn't, or if it does, that you get on the sheet of paper. The one that cannot be tested is your weighted gauge. And I'll show an example of that one here. And the reason being is because the master gauge is a dial gauge, whereas the weighted gauge typically has the 5, 10, or 15. If there's any nicks or gouges in that weight, usually you want to purchase a new one because it can offset that weight for that. So you can see in this picture here, kind of the differences. This particular one is a dial gauge here, and then the example over here, kind of in the upper left-hand corner, is more of a weighted gauge. The dial gauge will have something called a counterweight, or I like to call it a regulator, that you put on to help build up the steam, or keep the steam in that pressure can. And it also has some safety features on the newer ones to keep, so if it gets too much pressure in it, this safety valve actually pops out and it releases the pressure that's within that canner. You also want to make sure that if you inherit a pressure canner, or if you find one at a garage sale or local thrift store or wherever it might be, that there are instructions that come with that canner, or contacting that manufacturer to see if you can get the instruction manual for that. The weighted gauges, especially because each manufacturer is a little bit different, so it will tell you how many times it actually needs to rock back and forth for that it's at that specific pressure. So kind of went over a lot of these. So weighted versus dial gauge. So weighted gauge, they control the pressure by rocking or jiggling, so you'll feel that jiggling. If you ever had a grandmother or great grandmother or aunt or anybody that canned before, you may have heard that, where it kind of rocked back and forth. You heard that jiggling noise. The dial gauge, the difference with that one is you actually need to watch it so that it actually maintains that constant pressure, because if at any time that pressure drops below what is for that recipe, you have to build it back up to that pressure and then restart the timer all over again. The weighted, like I said, doesn't need to be checked for accuracy, but if it has any nicks or gouges in that weight, you do want to make sure that you can purchase a new one for that. Like I said, the dial gauge is checking that accuracy each year. You can contact your local extension office to have that done. The weighted gauge, of course, the jiggling or the rocking indicates that it's working properly. And then the weighted ones cannot be corrected precisely for higher altitudes. So you kind of want to be mindful of that. One of the other things is small pressure cookers or saucepans. A lot of people use these to cook, soup beans or something like that, and then they're actually not recommended for canning, because these cookers or canners need to hold at least 4 quart-sized jars. So these ones that are more like a saucepan size, they're not big enough to hold that quart-sized jar. A lot of the tested recipes are typically used for the 16-quart or larger type of pressure canners. So a couple of serious errors that happen when it comes to pressure canning is the high altitudes. So when you live in a higher altitude, the internal canning temperatures are lower, so you'll need to correct this by canning at a higher pressure. And the second thing is actually not exhausting the air before you put the regulator onto that vent valve. And so typically you need to exhaust some steam out of it for at least 10 minutes, and it has to be a constant stream for that to come out. One good way to make sure to check your altitudes, a lot of people have smartphones now, so if you go into the compass of that compass app or something like that, it will actually tell you what the altitude is. I know for iPhones they do that. I can go into my compass of it and click on the altitude, and it will tell me my exact altitude for where I'm at. Because there is a wide difference of altitudes in this area, or even if you're joining us from a different state, your altitude is going to be different from East Tennessee. So pressure must be increased in a canner when you're in an altitude of over 1,000 feet. So that's important to remember. So this is kind of a graphic of showing you the different steps for pressure canning. So, you know, placing those hot jars into 2 to 3 inches of water in that canner, building the temperature up, and then releasing the steam out of that vent port for at least 10 minutes at a constant stream. And so once that timer goes off, then you can put either the weight or that regulator onto that valve, and then you start building up the pressure. And so typically you want to get the pressure up to at least, if you're using a dial gauge, up to quickly up to that 8 psi's. And then once you get to that 8, you want to bring down the temperature and let it slowly, gradually reach to where it needs to be at. A lot of times it's usually around 11 or 12, but it can go up to 15, it can go down to 5, it can go down to 10. Just make sure that you look at that recipe that you're using for that specific food product. And of course, you let the, once it gets to that pressure that it needs to be at, then you start the timer and you keep an eye on it, making sure that it's rocking back and forth if you're using a weighted gauge, or that dial stays at where it's supposed to be at. So once that happens, once the timer goes off after the processing time, of course you turn off the heat. You remove the canner from the heat and let it depressurize. So like I said, it can take anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to do that. And so once that happens, you'll just kind of let the jar sit in there for about 10 minutes. And then after that 10 minutes, you can take them out of that canner. And you want to make sure that when you take your jars out of your canner, that you leave about a 1-inch space in between each one of them, just so that the air can flow in between them and cool them down. Also, once you take your jars out and you put them where they need to be at onto that cooling rack or those towels, you want to leave them, not disturb them, for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. You know, this will help them seal properly. So say, you know, you come back 24 hours later and you check your jars, you want to make sure you'll hear a clicking noise. If you hear a clicking noise, that means that it did not seal. If you don't hear a clicking noise, that means that it's sealed properly. So if you hear that clicking noise and it's within 24 hours that you processed it, you can actually reprocess that jar. You'll just need to take off the lid of it, put on a new lid, and then put it back into either that water bath canner or that pressure canner. A lot of times if it's just 1 or 2 jars, sometimes it's not worth trying to reheat up a whole pot of water just to reprocess that. So that's one of the things to remember. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go into my kitchen real quick, and I'm going to show you all some of the equipment. So it's going to go blank for a minute, but I'll be on in less than 20 seconds. Okay, everyone. Anastasia, can you hear me? Is it showing up as a full screen?
Not a full screen, but I can see you and hear you.
Yep, I can see and hear you too.
Okay. So I'm going to come right here. So a couple of different pieces of equipment that I have here. So these 3 canners here are water bath canners. So these 2 are more traditional type water bath canners. This is the electric water bath canner. This is has come out here in recent years. This one is good if you happen to have like a very small kitchen or your stovetop is not big enough to do that. So there's a couple different options for your water bath canner. So this particular one, if you open it, you'll see that it has different racks. And so I'll leave it over here. So the racks here, actually this one will come and it sets up on the side of the canner so that whenever you're loading jars into it, you can load your jars into it and then you take it and you lower it back down into the canner. And so it keeps it up off of the bottom of the canner from the direct heat. This particular one has a smooth bottom. So this one could potentially be used for a smooth top stove if that smooth top stove is designed to be able to use for canning. The other one, the other water bath canner that I have here, you'll see more traditionally in stores. This one actually has like kind of a ripple bottom on it, okay? This one you don't want to use on your smooth tops because this can actually crack your smooth tops. So you want to make sure, but it's very important that you make sure that it's a smooth bottom. Now, if you live in a home that you don't have a lot of kitchen space or anything like that, one thing that you can do is you can take, you can actually purchase a pressure canner. And the pressure canner can actually be used both for a water bath and pressure canning. So this particular pressure canner, this is a 16 quart. This is a more newer one. But you'll see here in the pressure canners, they do have racks on the bottom. So it does come out, but it's placed on the bottom of it, and this helps keep the jars off of the direct heat, the bottom of it. So this particular canner lid is a dial gauge canner lid. So you can see here, this is the dial gauge. You have the vent port here. This is the safety valve here. So if the pressure in the canner builds up too much, this will pop out and release any pressure that might be in there. This back here is the vent port lock. So if there's pressure in the canner, this will actually pop up and will lock in place so you can't actually get the lid off of the canner. So this particular canner here, you'll see that it has 2 arrows. You want to make sure that those arrows line up and so that it actually locks in place here. And this is the regulator that goes on top of that vent port. So the other thing, the other example, I have a lid here, is the weighted gauge. And so this weighted gauge one, you'll see on here that there is a 5, a 10, and a 15. So the 5 is the 5 PSIs, the 10 is 10 PSIs, and 15 PSIs. So you'll notice on here that there's only a vent port in the center. So you still have to release that steam out of this canner for that 10 minutes before you put the weight on there. So we can put it on 10 here, and it fits on there. And this one also has a safety valve on it that it pops out whenever there is too much pressure in that canner. A couple other things that I do have up here that could be important. So just some basic canning supplies that you might need. Of course, the ladle. This ladle here is very good. It's a much larger one. You know, about half a pint is what fits in here. You have a jar lifter. This is going to be very important to take your jars, to lift them up and into the canner, and then lift them out of the canner. You'll see here that I have different examples of jars. So I have a half pint here, a pint, and then a quart and another quart. So the difference between these two quarts here is one is a regular mouth and one is a wide mouth. So a lot of times people like the wide mouth ones because it's easier to get things in and out of that jar. The other thing that we have in here is a bubble releaser. So anytime that you load food into a jar, you want to make sure that you release any bubbles that might be in it. So just getting it down into that canner to release any of those, or that jar to release any of those bubbles. So I'll take this off real quick so you can kind of see. So once you get your food loaded in there, then of course you'll just run this bubble releaser down in it to release any air bubbles that might be in there. And you'll notice sometimes that your headspace will actually decrease when you do this. You want to do this for any food that you can. The other thing is a lid lifter. So this is to get lids out of a little hot saucepan that you have of warm water that has the lids in there, so you can lift it out of that and put it in there. So one thing that I do want to show you, this bubble releaser here does have, this particular one has what kind of looks like little steps, and you'll see where it says like a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, a 3/4, and 1 inch on it. But if you don't have a bubble releaser that has this, you can actually use your jar to determine the headspace. So usually this very top ring here, just below it is a 1/4 inch. The next ring just below it is 1/2 inch. And then this bottom ring here just below it is typically about 1 inch. So that can kind of give you an idea of, just in case you don't have a bubble releaser that has that. You do want to have a funnel that is a canning funnel. As you can see, this has a little bit wider mouth, and so this allows the food to drop into that jar. A couple other things that I have here are different types of citric acid, and you will find these in the canning aisle, and you will see on here, it tells you exactly how much to add for your citric acid into that food, and depends on the size of your jar. So those are a couple of different things for canning. I also kind of plan to do a jams and jellies specific class. So those have a little bit different types of ingredients for that. So I can kind of go over that a little bit more in a different class. So I'm going to run back into here into my little office. And so if you need to, let's see, just to answer any questions that you might have, okay? Okay, so I'm back. So is there any, Anastasia, what kind of questions are individuals having?
There haven't been any in the chat box so far. So if anyone has one, now's a great time to go ahead and type that in.
Or if you like, you can unmute yourselves. Okay, so one thing that I'm going to show you all, like I said, is I'm going to show you the different websites.
Okay, we've got a few questions coming up.
Okay. I'll share this for you all so y'all can see the different websites if you need to write those down. But go ahead, Anastasia.
The first one says, did you say that county extension offices will check to see if canners are safe or will advise you to toss it out?
Yes, so call your local extension office, depending on what county you're in. If you're in Washington County, of course, you'll get me. And we can look at your pressure canner to make sure that the gauge is working properly. We also, some of us will check the gasket seals also to make sure that those are not dry rotted. So if they are, then you can also replace those gaskets too.
Okay. And then someone is asking if canning potatoes with the skins on. They've heard of people doing that and wanted to know what your thoughts on that was.
So potatoes, let me grab my little thing here. So even though I know a lot about canning, I do use this book a lot about different things. And so for potatoes, there are different things. Typically with potatoes, if they're new potatoes or white potatoes, you want to wash and peel those. And the sweet potatoes, you want to wash the sweet potatoes, and you also want to remove the skins when you do that. So, and I say this because it's out of a tested recipe book, so it's good to peel them.
Our next question says, salsa recipes call for so much vinegar. Can we substitute commercial lemon juice or citric acid?
If that recipe will allow you to do that. So typically some of the tested recipes typically request for you to use that, whether it's vinegar, lemon juice, or citric acid. You do want to follow that because there is a kind of a ratio that they use for that. So just double check your recipe. You can also contact your extension office and see if we have a recipe that doesn't call for so much vinegar and use those other ones.
Are you able to tell whether the food done in a water bath canner is okay even when the top has depressed properly?
Repeat that again.
It says, are you able to tell whether the food done in a water bath canner is okay even when the top has depressed properly?
So what I'm thinking is if you're talking about the lid, if it's depressed properly, if it has vacuum sealed properly, if it has, usually if you know that you're the one that canned it and that you did it to the amount of time that it asked for in that specific recipe, it should be okay. If somebody else did it, that's one thing that you've got to make sure that they know what they're doing when it comes to canning, and then they do follow tested recipes when they do that.
The next one says, how about cold canned pickles?
That one I will have to, are you talking about raw packing pickles?
It doesn't say, so if the person that asked that question wants to clarify a little bit, it just cold canned pickles. While they're working on that, the next one is, are pressure canners with gasket seals better or worse than those without gasket seals?
So this one is a preference for it, depending on what you want. The ones that don't have the gaskets are typically what they call the all-American ones. So it's metal on metal. But you also, for those you have to get the knobs turned just right and in a certain order. Whereas gaskets, you have to make sure that your gasket is not dry rotted, there's no nicks or anything like that in it. So it's kind of one of those, it's more of a preference what kind of pressure canner you want to use, whether it's weighted, dial gauge, or the All-American.
And back to the pickles, they said yes, raw packing the pickles.
So usually, yeah, pickles are one of those that are usually what they call raw packed. So a lot of times the cucumbers, I know with cucumbers, a lot of times you don't heat those up. You just cut them into the size that you want, whether you want it in spears or like quarter size type things. And so if you're using cucumbers, it's typically raw packing. If it's a different one, if you're doing like okra or something like that, just follow that recipe for that specific pickling.
Okay. Somebody tuned in a little late and says, can you please tell me why you have to let the pressure release naturally?
So releasing the pressure naturally is part of the process. So they call it depressurizing. So it's one of those that you don't want to speed it up because that's still part of kind of the processing time. So not speeding that up is important because it could also bust your jars inside your canner. And so that's not good. Those are no fun to clean up, especially if there's glass involved.
The next one is, I've always heard that you have to sanitize your jars and lids before canning with them. Did you cover that, or will you?
Okay, yeah, so it is important to make sure that you wash your jars before you ever get started, before any season. Just wash them before, and so a lot of people wash them in the dishwasher or even hand wash. And so what I do for the jars is once I've washed them, I actually put them in the oven at 250 degrees, and you just kind of lay them on their side with the opening facing out towards you, so you can just grab them with tongs. But usually I wash my jars first, and then I stick them in the oven at 250 degrees. So by the time I'm ready to pack my food products in it, the jars are heated to where it needs to be at. The lids, you do want to put those in a warm water bath, and a lot of people will put it in a little small saucepan. They'll put it in there, and then they will put it on a very low heat, just to soften that compound that's on that lid.
And the last one for now, how are Clausen pickles made?
Awesome. I'm not really sure how those specific pickles are made. Commercial is usually done a little bit different. I know on one of the So Easy to Preserve videos that they have on pickling, you may be able to find it on YouTube. They actually have, as part of their pickling video, it tells you a specific, I think it talks about Mount Olive and how they do their pickles. So that might kind of give you an idea of how they do commercial type pickles.
Okay, it says, can you reuse seals? I asked to see if she was talking about reusing lids.
So yeah, so reusing lids, once you used them once, you can't use them again. So if you put them on a jar and process it and everything, and it's sealed, you can't use it again. It's one of those one and done type things. You might be able to use it if you're using it to cover a jar, if you're putting like dry goods or something in it. A lot of people use them they'll reuse them to make crafts or something like that. But for canning, once you use it once, you can't use it again.
Is it better to remove the rings after jars have been processed?
So the rings, yes. So once your jar has sealed, you can take the rings off of it, and this will help them prevent them from rusting in storage. So you just want to make sure that that lid is sealed onto that jar before you take the ring off. So with jams and jellies, a lot of times what you want to do, still just get a warm soapy cloth and just kind of wipe around the rings of it and the lid, just to, if there's any kind of sugar or anything that could have gotten on the outside of that jar. to prevent any mold growth or yeast growth on the outside of the jar. Yes, you can reuse the rings, but you cannot reuse the lid. So that's the 2-part ring and lid. I saw that from. Any other questions? So of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to your local extension office. A lot of us typically do food preservation classes. We do home canning classes as part of our programs. A lot of us do it during the summer, so that you get that hands-on experience. There's a difference, you know, when you have that hands-on experience for those classes. And so a lot of us will do like individual classes, or we'll do something called a canning college. But any other questions?
Lots of thank yous for the great information.
Yes, thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope that you all join us next Tuesday, April 28th, at 5:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about freezing and drying those days. And then also I'll look at doing a jams and jellies, specifically jams and jellies type class. I actually may do a video on strawberry jam so that people can see how that process is done.